The following is distributed by the Berean Call.
Chapter 3, Volga Idyll. The reason for my standing there that day with a rope around my neck was inextricably intertwined with a story that had begun more than 30 years before in a Russian village on the banks of the Dnieper River. There, on an August morning in 1908, a baby girl was born to the Zeitner family. The beautiful dark-haired mother, holding the little bundle so closely in her arms, looked tenderly at the tiny face beside her and fingered the downy hair. "Like your father. He'll be so pleased. My little Maria, that's what we'll call you, Maria." My father had been born in Russia, as had my mother, but they were German citizens born of parents who had immigrated from Germany to establish a life in this vast and sparsely populated land of opportunity. From her home in Krasnodar in the Caucasus Mountains, Mother had come to marry my father and set up housekeeping in the home where I was to be born. There, in the village of Sengajuka, surrounded by relatives, their own German countrymen, and a rapidly growing family, they lived and worked and were for a time content. As time passed, however, some new and exciting ideas began circulating in the village. Father was employed by the Krupp and Tyson subsidiary works in Russia. They paid a moderate salary and even supplied a small home to each worker for a low rent. But Father was dissatisfied, and so were his brothers. Must they work from sunup to sundown, always ruled by the foundry bell, earning their small wages? Surely, if they took a little initiative, explored the opportunities elsewhere? "My mind is made up," my father had said one day. "There's no real future here. I'm going with Alexander and Otto to do some investigating further east. Who knows? Maybe I could establish my own factory." And so he had said goodbye, leaving my mother to anticipate my birth alone. The news was good when it came. They'd found an agricultural community, Urbach, on the river Volga, composed of Swabians who still spoke their old German dialect, though they had been Russian citizens for many years. These hard-working farmers tilled the rich soil with wooden plows and beat out the grain as it had been done centuries ago. It was an ideal place to set up a factory for building farm implements. My father and his two brothers were already at work negotiating for the land. But it would take time. As a German citizen, he could, at best, only obtain a 99-year lease, but when that time had expired, there would surely be a new contract for his descendants. There was so much to do. The buildings must be begun before the winter snows fell, a home obtained for the family. From Krupp, he could get the needed machinery to make a start. I was already 6 weeks old when at last my mother was able to set out on her journey to a new life. Franz, come and see," I laughed, rolling off the furry belly on which I'd been bouncing. I scrambled back up, grasping the upthrust paws, and bounced as before. With childish squeals of delight, I tumbled off once more, till I flushed and breathless on the parlor rug. Misha, the brown bear, eyed me with a patient grin. "Maria, you know you shouldn't let Misha in the house. What would Mother say?" Franz looked at me disapprovingly, as befitted an older brother. "Father would let me," I replied mischievously. I wasn't quite as sure as I sounded, but it was my father who had brought little Misha home from the forest as a pet for us. Now he wasn't so little any more, but tame nevertheless, and as long-suffering of my boisterous antics as if he had been a St. Bernard dog. It is this and other happy scenes that my childhood memories evoke. Prosperity had come quickly to Urbach on the Volga. Bewildered as the peasants were by the rapidly sprouting buildings and the newfangled machinery which had appeared in their midst, it was nothing compared to the reaction when the smelting oven had first been fired. They'd come running then, with water buckets and shovels to help douse the fire. Afterwards they'd laughed, and it had become a village joke. They'd thought that already the new factory was burning down. It didn't take long, however, to understand what this fiery-eyed monster could mean in their lives, and machinery was soon revolutionizing life for them. We lived on a huge property at a corner of the main street and the one leading to the railway station. On the same lane lived my uncles Alexander and Otto and their families, and on our own park-like grounds among the trees and flowers was a little house where my grandparents lived. Within our home, always ready should she come by train for a visit, was my maternal grandmother's room. I was never lonely. How could I be, with grandparents and cousins so close by, with my own brother and the babies that seemed to arrive so regularly, and with the servants? I flitted from house to garden to grandmother's, and sometimes to the factory. Life was so exciting, and my white dresses so confining. When I slipped away to explore the factory with its whirring, clanking machines, its intriguing handles and levers, its treasures of nuts and bolts and scraps to be found on the floor, the telltale smudges always gave me away, and I'd have to be washed and changed again when I returned. Obviously, I was to be brought up to be a lady, as my mother was. She moved with slender grace about the rooms, seeing that the household ran smoothly, then retiring to her favorite chair with her crochet hooks or a baby. There I often sought her company, and she was never unavailable. Sometimes I watched in fascination while she heated a pencil-like metal stick on glowing coals, and as she traced smoking brown lines on a thin piece of wood, a picture grew before my wondering eyes. Yes, wood-burning was my elegant mother's hobby. In the kitchen, Katya cooked and baked with the help of Lena and Emma, the kitchen maids. If there were guests for dinner, then my brother and I ate with these three and the other servants in an annex off the kitchen. On such occasions I appeared in the parlor briefly to say a proper hello in my lace collar and high-buttoned shoes, trying hard to be well-behaved, as my mother had taught me. Usually, however, we all ate together around the huge dining room table, from cook to governess to nurse and the rest. Afterwards, my father never failed to take the German Bible and read in his warm, clear voice to the large household assembled around him. As long as I can remember, my parents were Baptists, though my father came from a Lutheran family and my mother was a Mennonite. In winter-time, we often went by sleigh to the Baptist congregation in Norca, where my Uncle Otto eventually moved. In summer, the pastor and some others from there came to join us in our spacious garden for worship. The servants and most of the plant workers also came to these meetings. Alexander, our beloved Uncle Sasha, led the Sunday school. Those who cared to brought picnic lunches, and in the afternoon there was singing and Bible study. On rainy Sundays, a ready shelter was available within the factory complex. We kept a governess for my brother in those days, and sometimes I crept after him into the room where he did his lessons. I remember the year I was 5. It was just before Christmas, and Franz and I had to memorize some poems in honor of the holiday. Mine was short, and I wished so much to learn my brother's as well, so I sat quiet as a mouse, listening carefully as Olga helped Franz with the poems and songs which had been selected for him. At last the great day came. Proudly my brother recited his pieces, and proudly I echoed them when he was finished. After that, I was allowed to sit in the classroom whenever I wished. On cold winter days, I loved to snuggle up to the clay oven in the dining room. Its rounded form filled a corner of the room, reaching not quite to the ceiling, and it was in this room I loved to sit, turning the pages of a picture book or tracing with my finger the designs painted on the oven's warm and comforting sides. Vanya, the old hired man, would bring in great bundles of straw to keep the fires going. On some days it seemed that the handfuls never stopped going in, and I would blow a breath ring on the frosted window panes to see the snow piled high over the garden. That clay stove was not only a haven of warmth for me, but it became the hiding place of stolen treasure as well. A peculiar bird, larger than a raven, inhabited these parts, and we had several of these easy-to-tame birds as house pets. They had an eye for beauty, at least for shiny objects, and on their occasional flights about the house, they sometimes collected silver or salt shakers from the table and carried them up to the top of the oven, there to be retrieved by an agile servant. More than once my mother searched high and low for a piece of missing jewelry, only to find it hidden on top of the oven. Amusing as these birds were, nothing could compare with our beloved Misha. My cousins loved him too, and we couldn't imagine life without our big, furry playmate. He grew big and strong, but we had no fear. One fall day, when the sausages were being made for winter and the hams cured, one of the workers coming from the barn playfully reached out a bloody hand to Misha. With a relish of discovery, the bear began licking. Amusement turned to frightened cries for help, however, when he felt his hand caught between sharp teeth and shaken. Several men came running and tried to pull the now growling animal away, but Misha was gripped by primitive impulse, and only a bullet from my father's pistol could force him to relinquish that bloody hand. Sorry as we were for poor Boris, we cried for days for our Misha. One never-to-be-forgotten day in 1912, a most unusual commotion became apparent in the street outside our home. "Look, Maria, see what's happening," my mother ordered. As I ran outside, the strange noise I had heard grew louder, more threatening. It was obviously an engine, but nothing like the familiar factory sounds, and it was coming down the street, too. As I burst outside, there, grinning from ear to ear, was Uncle Otto at the wheel of a strange new machine that was just coming to a chugging halt in front of our house. Excitedly, I learned that he had branched out into the automobile business and had bought an agency in the next town where he had already moved. With the factory prospering, there was money to invest in other enterprises, and this was his venture. The sunflower oil plant that Uncle Alexander had recently bought with profits from our factory paled in interest beside the gleaming and rather frightening machine confronting me in the street. Already people were gathering to admire it, and I quickly assumed an appropriate air of importance. When Uncle Sasha's children came running, demanding a ride, all dignity vanished. "Please, please, me too," I yelled. "Jackets and scarves, quick," my uncle laughed, and away we flew, coming back dressed properly for such a windy and glorious adventure. We arranged ourselves excitedly, waved to our envious playmates, and away we went, pink-cheeked, scarves flapping, and deliriously happy. Later, when I was safe on the ground again, I felt in my childish imagination that I had come perilously close to flying. At dinner, I heard an amusing aftermath to this first intrusion into Urbach of the horseless carriage. When the old couple who lived across the street had seen us coming, they jumped up from their little bench to stare, exclaiming, "Holy Mary and Joseph! It's black! It's running by itself! It doesn't need horses! It must be the Antichrist!" It was the first car they had ever seen. As with children everywhere, Christmas was the best of all the many happy times of the year. For a whole week before that wonderful day, none of us were allowed into the parlor. We children knew that behind that locked door, exciting things were being prepared. At last, Christmas Eve arrived, and we were bundled up in furs and blankets and lifted into the sleigh for the ride to church. My short legs couldn't reach the hot stones placed as foot warmers on the floor of the sleigh, but in my excitement I scarcely noticed the cold. All of us children carried little lanterns in different colors, and we laughed as we skimmed along to see them cast colorful shadows over the soft white snow. Returning from the service, we stood with bated breath at the forbidden door. Father opened it, and oh, the dazzling sight that gladdened my little girl eyes. There was the tree, almost touching the ceiling and twinkling with what I was sure must be 1,000,000 stars. It was covered with little flickering candles, clamped onto the branches and laden with decorations which to my childish eyes seemed to have been fashioned in fairyland itself. Then we were hushed as Father gathered us together to read the Christmas story and to pray. For a 5-year-old, it was a bit difficult not to wonder, as he read, what was contained in those mysteriously shaped parcels under the tree, and which were mine. Christmas came only once a year, but for me there was an enchanted hour that came daily and of which I never tired. It was in the evening, before the petrol lamps were brought in, when it was already too dark to read without their help, that my mother would take her place in a low chair and gather us children around her. In her arms was the youngest baby. Beside her on the floor was the next youngest, and so on to Franz, the eldest. Two of those gathered so briefly on these evenings, Ella and Irma, died as infants during those years, and my little brother Edward was to die the summer I was 6. But always when my mother's soft soprano rose in that hushed room, the troubles of my young world seemed to vanish. There were folk songs and children's choruses. There would even be fairy tales, and at those times when I wanted to imagine what the heroine was really like, I looked up into my mother's face. There was more to those evenings than idle talk and fairy tales, however. After a while, my mother would grow serious, and looking lovingly at each one of us older ones in turn, would ask us whether we had anything to confess. Quickly I learned to conceal nothing. If I did and it was found out, the punishment came as surely as the dawn. When I did say my whispered, "I'm sorry," I was forgiven and went to bed relieved and comforted and infinitely happy. And so the days passed in my safe childhood world. Then in September of 1914, something called a war began. Just what this was, I didn't know, though I knew it had something to do with soldiers and guns and unpleasant things that happened to other people far away. None of those bad things that I sometimes heard were occurring in other places could ever happen here anyway. In the village of Urbach, everyone was our friend. My father had brought prosperity here, and these people, though Russian citizens, were German like ourselves. Here everyone spoke our native language, and even the street names were German. The only authority I knew, other than my parents, was in the person of the 2 village policemen, and they were familiar friends also. So I wasn't prepared for what happened that hot September day. I was playing outside when I looked up to see Sergei and Nikolai enter the yard in their uniforms. They'd been to our place often, but usually in civilian dress. Now I watched curiously as they entered the factory office. When my father emerged not long after, handcuffed between the 2 policemen, I ran to him screaming. He tried to stoop down and lift me up, but of course he couldn't, and I screamed even louder. Mother ran out of the house, and others soon gathered, but no one was allowed to come near my father. "I'll be taken away. I don't know where," he managed to say quietly to my mother before he was let off. To my horror was added puzzled incomprehension that he didn't seem surprised at this terrible thing that was happening to him. My mother fell to the ground, senseless, and was carried into the house. That evening there was no singing in the darkening parlor, and only after I was in bed did Katya and Olga come to me with drawn and solemn faces. But where is Father?" I sobbed. "And Mama," I added. It seemed unthinkable that she could have forgotten my good-night kiss. There, soothed Katya, taking me in her arms. "You'll see your Mama at the breakfast table. She's very, very tired and must get some rest. As for your father, God will take care of him." In the morning, Mother was there as usual, but now there were dark circles under her sad, beautiful eyes. We children learned that now Russia and Germany were enemies, and that was why they had taken Papa away. It gave me small comfort later when I met my little friends from across the street to find that their fathers were still home. They were German like mine. "Weren't they?" I protested, and I ran home to question my mother at this injustice. "Ah, yes," she said, "but they are Russian citizens, and we are not." The same day, Aunt Lena arrived by automobile with her 5 children to tell us that Uncle Sasha and Uncle Otto had been taken away, too. When she learned the fate of my father, the 2 women shared their grief. What was to be done? In a few days, we knew partially what was in store for us, when a group of rough-looking men came and hurriedly began unrolling wire and pounding in stakes. Our entire property was fenced in, and we, too, became prisoners.